All right, so we're going to be talking. Well, first of all, my name is Yishai from the New England Fertility Institute clinic in Connecticut in the United States. I am the international representative for the clinic. I'm based in Spain and I work with our international patients. And I'm based here in order to be of more assistance. So I'm in the same time zone and I speak Spanish, I speak English, I speak Hebrew, and I'm more accessible to the patients that come to us from other countries, especially Europe, where we have a large amount of patients that come to our clinic and have been coming to our clinic for many years. So that's just kind of in a nutshell what I am, who I am. And I'll be talking about the advantages of working with in the United States and with our clinic specifically for patients that require fertility treatments, especially surrogacy and egg donation, which is what we mainly focus on. Okay, so I can move through this, right? Okay, so we'll talk about our clinic, about the options for creating embryos, a little about the IVF process, and about egg donor and surrogate guidelines. And then we'll have Alexa to talk about the surrogate's perspective. And of course, we can do any questions and answers. This presentation won't be long, so I will leave time for questions too. So a little bit about the egg donation and surrogacy journey. Well, at our clinic, it's our motto that it takes a team. And we are relatively we're not a huge clinic. We are in terms of size, we try to keep it small on purpose and boutique because we have just one doctor, Dr. Lavi, and the reason also that he can't always participate in webinars and in events is because he is just the one doctor and he sees all of our patients. So he's always hands on with them at all times, and that's why a lot of the times for these types of events, that's why we have the team of myself and Stephen and others to do this kind of content because he's always
Mhm.
busy with the patients and everybody sees him. So you have the case manager. So someone like myself, whenever a patient works with us, then they are assigned a coordinator or a case manager, and we work with them throughout the whole process. And he always sees the same person, and it's a very personal care throughout the entire journey, every step of the way. We have a lot of clinicians and scientists and mental health professionals, and at all of these are in-house in our clinic. So we have a very big laboratory to handle a large caseload. And because even though we are a relatively smaller clinic with just one doctor, we handle about 300 cycles per year.
Okay.
And I'll get into that a little bit later. And and we'll talk about more of the service providers as well in the United States in general. So more specifically about us, our clinic was established 30 years ago. In Connecticut, it was the first of its kind of this type of clinic in the northeast of the United States that handled IVF and surrogacy, where patients could do it outside of a hospital. It was an outpatient facility, for the first of its kind. And 30 years later, today, we have created over 10,000 babies. I should say Dr. Lavi has because he was the founder and he's the owner and he's still the medical director and the only doctor at our clinic. So it's all really attributed to him, and he's a really fantastic doctor, very well known in general in this field and in the world as well. Very outspoken about IVF and international IVF and how LGBTQ as well, and how everyone should have a right to have a child and do this freely. And oops, it
Oh,
disappeared.
you
And
lost the presentation.
yeah, and we were among the first clinics to specialize specifically in this. So, like I said, we originally started as an IVF clinic, but now in the last few years, we're focusing all our efforts just on what's called third-party reproduction, which is, surrogacy egg donation, and that's 95% of all we do these days. And that is on purpose because it enables us to be more focused on that and for the whole system to operate as efficiently as possible just for this purpose. Um, so, like I said, we were big enough to handle a relatively large amount of cases per year and have a very, very big laboratory with many embryologists and state of the art equipment and the latest technology. But we're small enough intentionally to give this kind of white glove treatment to every patient and a personal care. Like I said, unlike many other maybe larger clinics where you might see one doctor for one thing and another doctor for another thing, and then the embryo transfer is done by perhaps a third doctor and these kinds of things. And it's very important, the continuity in these types of processes, and that's really what we put a big emphasis on. And I would say it's one of the biggest things that sets us apart from other clinics, because in all fairness, in all honesty, many clinics in the United States are among the best in the world, and the doctors are all wonderful, really. But what is important for us is always to make sure that the patient feels that he comes first or she comes first, and that they are always seen by the same people, the same faces, and there's this continuity. So that's what I was just talking about. We're very communicative. Dr. Lavi gives all of his patients his phone number. He speaks to every single one of them, and it's a very inclusive environment. We're just 1 hour away from New York City, in a city called Stamford, Connecticut, and with just one train ride from Manhattan, from the airport, you can reach our clinic. So it's very, very convenient. For that reason is why we've been working with so many international patients over the years, because it's really easy to get there. And the environment on the east coast of the US is also very friendly and accepting and open for LGBTQ and for um, every type of patient, single, same sex, married, and unmarried couples, everything. So we really work with everyone, and everybody's welcome. Um, so in the US, one of the main differences is that it really is the leading state of the art in terms of basically in every aspect of the process. Its safety, and history of IVF in the United States is like nowhere else, frankly, in the world, pretty much, because it is actually commercially legal. Then that means that comes with a lot of restrictions, oversight, and regulation. So it's the most highly controlled and highly transparent process that you can find in the world, and it really enables the patient to control and decide. So you get to decide who's going to be your egg donor. You get to decide who's going to be your surrogate. Who am I going to work with? In which state? How many embryos will I transfer? All of these things. Will my surrogate plan to do a C-section? Am I going to try to do a natural birth? All these things can be debatable and decided in advance, and it offers a huge amount of peace of mind to the patients. Um, so, there is egg donor, for example, program in the United States. In our clinic, for example, when you work in the United States with egg donation, broadly speaking, you can work with an egg donor from a clinic. So a lot of clinics like ours has its own in-house egg donor program, or you can work with an egg donor from an agency. Now, when you work with an egg donor from a clinic, you have the advantage that this donor has already been pre-screened for many, many things: medical, genetic, family history, background, um, and so many other things that I'm forgetting probably right now. And also so much information is available. It's an anonymous donation, or not, if you choose not to be an anonymous donation. You can work on that too. But there is so much information provided to the parents, especially when you compare it to Europe. It's very, very startling for people from Europe to see, because you can get so many pictures and even videos of the donor and her family history and all of her genetic information, medical history, everything. So much information. There's huge profiles of 50 pages about for every donor, and flooded by information. So it's a big contrast to how things are done in most of Europe, and it's in order to give you the peace of mind, because at the end of the day, this is going to be your child, and you want to have as much control over it as possible, right? So, that's one other thing that sets us apart. We have our own in-house donor pool with about 80 to 100 donors active at every given moment, and we screen them very thoroughly. We meet them all one face to face, one by one, several times. We do the psychological evaluations for them in the clinic. So really, it's a very, very thorough screening process, and about, I'd say, 2% of all the applicants that apply to become egg donors with us really become, in the end, egg donors in our pool, visible for patients. Um, so we talked already a little bit about where we are, that it's easy to arrive to our clinic, and nowadays this is important because of COVID. If you are, let's say, if you want to have do a process in our clinic, then before Corona, most of the times the patients would come over to the clinic in the beginning for the first initial visit, which is to leave the sperm and to do some FDA blood work. But now that travel is more complicated, we've been shipping sperm. We've been doing that since before the pandemic too, regardless. But now we've been doing it a lot more for the last 2 years, and it's very easy. Like it's just another stage in the process, but it's really easily done. We can accept shipments from all over the world, sperm, eggs, don't embryos. It's really quite easy to do this. So now they're talking about that they might lift the travel ban to the United States. It's November. Maybe this month it'll be possible to travel again. So if it is, then that's going to be an option again, which is great because I think it's always a good idea to travel to the clinic if you can, meet everyone in person, and it's also less complicated to do so. Or you can still ship your sperm to us. It's all really doable. So both of these options exist, and in terms of costs, to be honest, there's not that much of a difference because shipping can be pretty expensive. This is specialized shipments with special IVF couriers. It's not a cheap um, thing to do. When you compare it to traveling, maybe one or two patients to the U.S. and staying for a few days to do the sperm donation and the FDA, it's almost more or less the same. So in terms of finances, there's not much of a difference. So, what's the process, broadly speaking? And I'm sure this might sound familiar to most of you, but I'll go over it broadly and maybe just emphasize things that might be different in the US. So, we can work with several options. You can use your own genetics, or if that's not an option and you need an egg donor or a sperm donor, then of course you can do either of those or both in the United States. And you have full control over this. Like I said, you can choose your donors, they don't get assigned to you. We can help recommend donors if you want us to assist you, but it's really your choice. So, whatever we're using, if it's a donor or if it's your own material, the process basically works like this. There's two big parts. One is that we create the embryos and we test them, PGS, I'll go into that in a moment, and we freeze them. And then we do the embryo transfer. We almost always do frozen embryo transfers because there's no difference in the success rates. And the frozen embryo transfer gives us more control over timing. So we can schedule it. It's easier to coordinate with the surrogate. It gives you a lot more freedom and less limitations. So when we create embryos, the first part over here, we basically, if it's an egg donor or if it's a female patient using her own eggs, we retrieve the eggs. Now, I'll talk specifically about egg donors because this is probably going to be a little more relevant. When we have an egg donor come in, then she has to, of course, go on a cycle, medications for about 2 weeks. Then we retrieve the eggs. And I didn't say this, I should have said before, but before we do the egg donor retrieval, we also would need to have the sperm of whoever's sperm it's going to be. We have to have the sperm at the clinic first because the sperm does come frozen and it can be thawed whenever we need to use it. But we like to use the fresh eggs. We like to do fresh egg retrievals. So we'll have the donor come in. She'll do this on the day of her retrieval. We'll retrieve the eggs, and we will fertilize them while fresh with the sperm. And then we grow these embryos for 5, 6, sometimes 7 days until they are called blastocysts. And at this stage, we do two things. One is that we do the PGS biopsy, and the second is that we freeze them. Now, what does this mean? And why do we do it? First of all, there are two big things here that are important to note, and they are responsible for, I'll get to it at the end, this success rate that you see here. The high success rates at our clinic are attributed to those two things. One is that we grow embryos to blast stage, day 5, 6, because that already eliminates and discards those embryos that perhaps at day 2 or 3 might not grow until day 5. So we see which are the ones that survive and make it to day 6. So that optimizes the selection process. And then the PGS is another thing which is very important because this is a screening that's done on the embryo, which checks for chromosomes, chromosomal normality, and karyotype. So we can see that there's the right number of chromosomes and that they're all in good condition because the PGS actually goes into these days very, very fine resolution. So even in the chromosomal level, if there are any fractures or breaks in the chromosome, and then we can, of course, see, and in addition to the chromosomes, there's a huge genetic panel that is done on the embryo in this screening. So it checks for hundreds of genetic diseases. And this is kind of like you could say instead of doing the oh, what is it called? I'm drawing a blank. The amniocentesis synthesis later on, instead of having to do an invasive procedure and do an amnio, The PGS basically does this in the embryo stage before it is implanted in the womb. So when we return and when the embryos come back from PGS screening and they are what's called PGS normal embryos, with this type of embryo blastocyst, which is PGS normal, we expect a 75 to 80% success rate when we do a single embryo transfer. This is a very high success rate. So most of the chances are that with one try, you're fine, you're good. You're going to be pregnant, you're going to have a baby. That's what the success means, baby. So not just pregnancy. And this is very high, and that's why, and those two reasons, the PGS and that we use blastocysts and PGS normal embryos. So like I said once, oh, and another thing, of course, is here you can see that we know the gender. The PGS reveals the gender of the embryos. So you can also select which embryo you'd like to transfer when the time comes. And some people say, oh, we don't mind the gender, just whichever embryo is the best quality, because the PGS kind of gives a qualitative score to the embryos. Might say just whichever embryo is the best, let's transfer that. Some people have a gender preference, so gender selection is completely legal in the US. There's no problem. We can do it whatever you choose in the end. So when the time comes after the embryos are frozen, we do the frozen embryo transfer. These days we do mostly single embryo transfers. We do double embryo transfers, but we mostly do single these days. It used to be in the old days kind of thing, like you would do a lot more. You do like you would transfer like 3 4 embryos at a time in the hopes that one would stick. So today that's really not the case anymore, at least in the United States, because the technology has evolved to a state where if you want to have one baby, you transfer one embryo, because the success rates are very high. Because if you are going to transfer two embryos, then as you can see here, 90% chances you will succeed, but there's 60 to 70% chance that you're going to have twins, that both embryos will implant. So, if you don't want to have two babies and twins, then you shouldn't put in two embryos. Um, and there are a lot of reasons for this. Okay, so basically, generally, that's how the process goes. That's the typical IVF process for a surrogacy, and also not for a surrogacy. But so when we're talking about the sperm, so this is a little bit about how we screen and the preparation for the IVF. So if it's a sperm donor or if it's your own sperm, there will always be a sperm analysis and the sperm will come frozen, as I mentioned. And there will be FDA testing, which is required in the United States by law for infectious diseases and for the person that is donating the sperm, so that we know that the sperm is fine, that the specimen that deposited the sperm is healthy at the time of the sperm deposit. And recessive disease screening. This is a genetic screening as well, that we perform both on the sperm donor and also later on the egg donor, and I'll talk about that too. I'll come back to it. So, if you do use donor sperm in the United States, there are a lot of donor banks which are very reputable, and we work with a great many of them, and they're great, and they're FDA regulated, and they there are literally hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of donors in these banks, and you can assume in the United States that if you have a sperm donor in a sperm bank, it's a healthy donor, and the sperm is going to be great, and you don't have to worry about anything really. You just have to check the genetics, and we'll talk about that soon. Now, if you're using your own eggs for the process, then a similar kind of screening goes into play here. You have to do an evaluation, which is a medical evaluation. We'll want to see that your ovarian function is good and normal, that you have um, eggs and follicles that we can work with. And like I said, the genetics. And the genetics is important on both sides. Why? Because we do a panel, an extensive panel these days, not just our clinic, but everywhere in the US pretty much. They use the same panel of 283 genetic diseases, which is all the most common genetic disorders in all ethnicities, are tested in this panel. And we do it for the sperm source and for the egg source. So if it's donor sperm, also all the donors have done this already, and you'll have the information in the sperm bank to see on every donor that you're interested in. You'll see their genetics, and if you're working with an egg donor, same thing. We'll tell you all of her genetics, and so the importance here is that if the donor of the sperm carries a certain gene, then it's important that the donor of the egg not carry that same gene as well, because then they're is no chance that this genetic disorder will be passed on and manifest as the disease in the child. But if both sperm and egg donor are carrying the same gene, then there is a great likelihood that this will manifest in the disease in the child in the future, and we will not allow that to happen. So that's the importance of the genetics. Um, I'll just move forward here. In terms of egg donors in the US, there are two ways of doing it, anonymous or known. Most of the time, it's an anonymous donation, simply because that's usually what the intended parents want, but you can do either. Um, I won't go into too much detail about the donor anonymous versus the known, but just to say that when we do an egg donation with an egg donor, I mean, who has been screened and tested, and we've approved her into our egg donor program, we typically expect it's more than 15. It's really more around the 20. 20 is the average amount of eggs that we would expect to retrieve. And we often get donors that retrieve many more eggs, and we can also know. So this is important because we test them in advance. Like I said, we pre-screen the donors, so we know their AMH and many other factors. And so if someone comes to us and says, I'm going to choose an egg donor from your program, but I only want to have one child. So we say, okay, great. So you can pretty much choose any egg donor because we wouldn't accept an egg donor in the first place if she didn't have at least a minimal number of eggs to produce a retrieval that will result in at least one child. We wouldn't take someone with a very low AMH. But if someone comes and tells us we want to have three kids, maybe four in the future, who knows, one now and then another, and we want to have also the potential of choosing gender. So we want a larger number of embryos so that we have bigger success in terms of like what we can choose to work with and having more kids down the line. So we will definitely say, all right, so we will help you navigate and find the best donor for that because you'll want to have a donor that is going to retrieve many more than 20 eggs in the hopes of getting a larger number of embryos and to maximize your chances of succeeding and creating the family that you desire. So this is
Yishai,
yes,
can I short interrupt because
of
there's a
course.
question? What information do I get from the egg donor from your database? Is it possible to get to know them personally?
Well, it's like I said in the beginning. There's really a large amount of information, starting from medical, personal. We even, like I said, we know them personally, so we can tell you about their personality. But now, because most of the times it is a anonymous donation, you will not know each other's real identities. But if I understand this question, it sounds like this is more about a known donation. If you are interested in having a relationship with your donor or for your kids to have one in the future, that's definitely a possibility. It's just a different type of donation, mainly in legal terms. You'll have to enter into an agreement, a
Mhm.
legal agreement with the donor. Um, and that's basically it. But otherwise, everything else is the same. And then once you have the consent from both sides to know each other, then of course you can be in a relationship and talk and communicate and get to know each other. That's very common in the United States. So you can know potentially everything about one another if that helps. But if it's an anonymous donation, you still get the full profile with all the information. And anyone who's interested who wants to work with us, we grant them access to our donor pool for free. It's all online. You can just browse through and look and get an idea, but it's a huge amount of information.
Okay.
Like, yeah. So if anyone is really, really interested, they can always just contact me and we'll talk about it. But many pictures, childhood pictures, adult pictures, family history, height, weight, of course, and personal like hobbies and characteristics, and a great ton of information. It's just that I can talk just about that for about an hour.
Okay. Thank
So
you.
I hope that that helps. Now, typically in one retrieval, just to end this slide, we will expect at least 5, 6 genetically normal embryos. That's always our goal because that is for sure going to be more than enough for even any worst case scenarios. And you will eventually, even at the worst case, you will become a parent. So nobody comes to the US and especially not to our clinic and does not succeed. It just doesn't happen. And this is really true about the United States in general, I feel, because it's not this kind of destination where people come and try again and again and again and again and and never succeed. It's usually exactly the opposite. You do it once and well, and that's it. We don't want you to start doing this, spending years and years and wasting tons of money for nothing. Like nobody wants that to happen. So that's partly why we ensure this. Just briefly about the egg donor screening. Well, I talked about this briefly, but just to kind of recap, there's a medical evaluation about her health and the ovarian reserves, as I said. There's a psychological evaluation, which we also do at our clinic, like I said. There is a genetic screening, which I mentioned, and the infectious disease testing. So I've already talked about this, but just to recap that. Now, about the carrier, there's kind of, you can say, a similar process. Not really, because it tests for different things, but in the sense that it is a pre-screening process. We want to make sure that the first and foremost that this woman who is going to be the surrogate has had her own children and has done so very successfully. Okay, so it's not. There are a lot of misconceptions, a lot of myths, and a lot of yeah, just kind of misunderstandings about how it goes in the United States. Because in the United States, the surrogate has to be someone who is already had her children, like I said, at least one child, and normally not interested in having more of her own children. And they had to have been very successful pregnancies. No complications, no preterm labor, good, healthy sizes. With just smooth sailing, pretty much. That's the main important thing. Um, Generally speaking, surrogates in the United States come from agencies. Alexa might want to talk a little bit more about that. And of course, we want someone who's healthy. So that means an age of usually not more than early 40s. It's a different age um, window than egg donors, of course, because egg donors have to be quite younger. I didn't mention, but egg donors are at most 30 years old usually, because we're interested in the quality of their eggs. Whereas here with the surrogate, we're interested in the health of her womb, her uterus, her its other reproductive organs. So it's not to do with the eggs, right? Because the surrogate mother is not related in any genetic or biological way to the baby. That's very important to understand as well. Sometimes it's misunderstood. So, of course, the age and the BMI, these are the two main things because that indicates that it's a healthy person. So, then this person, the surrogate, will also be screened at the clinic. We'll do first an evaluation of her medical records, then she'll come to the clinic and do an actual, we call it a marathon day because it's a very long day where she and usually her partner, if there is one, will come in together and we'll do psychological test screening and medical screening and ultrasound and and a great deal of other questionnaires and nurse consultations. So that all happens usually in one day, and that all happens before the embryo transfer. So in
Stop, stop it, stop, stop.
yes,
We had a new question. How to ensure that a surrogate mother behaves responsibly? For example, does not smoke, does not consume alcohol and drugs. Do you
yeah,
how can you guarantee this?
I'm going to leave this question for Alexa, so stay tuned. But I will just say that it's screened very, very. It's explicitly screened. Like one of the first things we check is in the blood tests for a surrogate is a nicotine, drug, any indications
Okay.
of that, alcohol, and then later on there's a legal agreement that is signed between the surrogate and the intended parents. A very big document with a lot of all the terms and conditions that all parties are required to fulfill, and it is very, very strict and binding, and there are very clear repercussions to what happens if a surrogate suddenly is, because she gets tested along the way, and if she suddenly comes back positive for something like alcohol or some drug or something like that, then she's in breach of contract, and there are very clear repercussions for what happens. Now, of course, nobody's following the surrogate around 24/7 with like a monitor or something
Yeah.
like that, but that's the importance of, and this is kind of a bigger concept to understand, that in the United States, because this is completely legal and very oversought and very well controlled, the most important thing here at the end is trust. And that's really the key here, because that's why the intended parents and the surrogates meet in advance. So it's not like you're assigned a surrogate. You first see a profile, and if you're interested in that person on paper, you meet her on a video call, and then you talk and you raise all the important questions. The agency assists with that, And if you feel that you can trust this person and all the screening comes back normal and she's healthy and fine, then you move forward. But the trust is always very important, and there are many ways to ensure that this trust is also maintained throughout. So at the end of the day, in America, these kind of extreme things like of a surrogate who suddenly goes rogue and I don't know starts smoking or something like that. These just generally don't happen. Really, they don't. Especially not when you're working with reputable agencies and reputable providers, and that's the importance of meeting the surrogate in advance and understanding that comes from a normal background with no like domestic issues, with no it's not women who are like in poverty and are dependent on this money to survive or make it through the month. All right, we can't work with people like that. That's not the idea. These are stable women from safe backgrounds and healthy homes with supportive environments where everybody knows that this is what they're doing, including their employers and their partners and their children and everybody in their life. Can't be a secret because everybody needs to be helpful and supportive of this woman because she is the most important woman in the whole process, pretty much. And everything rides on her. And Alexa can tell you later that it's a tremendous responsibility that the surrogates take very seriously in America. So
Okay,
it's a different thing. Yeah, you have to, because a lot of people compare it to other countries, and it's a very different situation in America. So I hope that that answers
I
a little
hope.
bit. All right, I'll try to wrap up soon. The timeline of the process, generally speaking, is that we first, like I said, we do the semen analysis on the sperm source. We freeze the sperm unless it's a donation and it's already frozen and been analyzed and okayed. Then we have that come to the clinic. Then you choose the egg donor, um, and then the egg donor comes in, does the retrieval, and then we create the embryos from the egg and the sperm, and we freeze them. At the same time, while all of this is happening, you can also and you should look and start looking into finding a surrogate. So that can take over 6 months these days, and this is because there's also the whole screening process and the legal agreement that it's the next step that you can see there. It can take quite a while to find a surrogate and get to the point with her that you're ready to do an embryo transfer. So that's why we recommend starting with that right off the bat. And then once we have the embryos and we have the surrogate, she's been screened and there's a legal agreement, then we can proceed to scheduling the embryo transfer. That's like really broadly how this goes. In fact, it's a very simple process and it's always the same. It's just that there are many moving parts, but you do it step by step, and it really is a very straightforward process. And we do hundreds of them a year, and they're all very successful. So that's generally speaking like my part of the presentation, and I'm gonna let Alexa now talk about the surrogate's perspective. Alexa, I'll just do a brief introduction. She's a previous surrogate herself, and she works in Abundant Life Surrogacy, which is one of the most wonderful surrogacy agencies in the United States that we work with as well. Um, and she will talk to you about the surrogate's perspective.
Okay.
Thank you, Yishai. Thank you, Chris.
Oh,
I appreciate
sorry.
it.
And sorry, and sorry, Alexa. I will ask you some questions to kind of guide the talk.
Okay.
But first, perhaps you can introduce yourself.
So I am Alexa. I am a two-time surrogate, and I have two children of my own. My surrogacy journey started about 4 to 5 years ago now, and am new to the other side, starting just this year with my surrogacy agency.
Nice. So, Alexa, which came first? You were a surrogate. You were also working for an agency. What came first, and how did it all develop?
So I had my daughter late 2016. My entire pregnancy, we said 2 kids seems good. 2 is good. We had a boy. We were having a girl. We felt very fulfilled as a family. But every time I said this is it, I just had a funny feeling and didn't know what it was. I didn't understand. I gave birth to my daughter and I said, yeah, I don't want more kids, but man, it feels good to have a baby. And I that's exactly what happened. Was I said, how do I keep having babies? And it led me to Abundant Life Surrogacy down in Boise, Idaho. And so I started as a surrogate 4 years ago or so, 4 to almost 5 years ago, right after I had my daughter. Like I said, I just felt like I needed to keep creating a family. And they made me feel very assured in that feeling. They said, that is normal. You're the exact person we're looking for because we need you to like creating babies, but be done with your own family. So I started my journey early 2017. I gave birth in August of 2018 the first time. And then I waited a few years in between, starting a next journey. And then just this year in June, I was able to start as a match coordinator. So I've stuck with my agency the whole time, and she kept her eye on me and decided she was ready for a new employee. And this is something I love. So it's worked out well for me that I get to do it personally and now help everyone else do it as well.
Hmm. And that's fantastic. That's also, just so you know, it's quite common in the United States that a lot of these agencies, surrogacy agencies, are founded by the employees that work there are themselves surrogates. So they have the best understanding of how this works and what is required, and it's really a very important point, actually. So you know that way the surrogate is well taken care of. You know that your needs are understood as well. So it's not like it's just business or something like that, right? It's a very personal, comes from a very
Very,
personal place.
very personal. Yes.
Yeah. So how was the screening process, and what kind of records did you have to provide? What kind of background checks did they do, and did it involve your family?
Um, the screening process can take anywhere from a month to 2 months at least. I provided all of my previous pregnancy records, any other pertinent medical records. Um, they went through all of my past wellness exams, everything like that. They do a criminal history background check, and they do that for myself, my spouse, any other grown people in your household. So if you have a roommate or anything like that, they do become a part of the process with you. Um, you fill out a lot of questionnaires, profiles, things like that. They get very detailed, very intense, because they're trying to decide that you are mentally prepared for this. Like you said, the financials, you can't be getting any state assistance or anything like that to depend on this. So they do a lot of that. My husband had to answer the questionnaires with me as well to make sure that my support person was on board, because like Yishai was saying, like this is a very intense process and they want to make sure that you have the best support possible. So we went through, yeah, everything medical, all the pregnancies, everything like that. We also met with a psychologist to be evaluated. And we did that again. My husband and I were both included in that. Um, that again, to make sure that mentally we were prepared for the journey itself, for the relationship with the parents, make sure mentally that we seemed capable and ready to do this. So it did involve my family very much. My children were small in the beginning, but it was something we were upfront with them about. And so it's different for everybody on what your support system looks like, but they are very much involved.
And there are usually home visits as well, isn't it?
Yes.
Like now in Corona, it was more complicated, but
Yeah.
usually that's the standard.
Exactly. And so they usually like to see exactly where you live, what your lifestyle looks like. So I saw the agency owner multiple times through video calls, and then she physically came to my home to take a look and make sure that what I was telling her matched what she could see in person. Mm-hmm.
So, and this leads into the other question that also was raised before about the concerns that intended parents have, rightfully so, about how do you manage the relationship, how do you trust, how do you ensure. Um, so, how did you, as a surrogate, address this?
So I really think through an agency is a really great way to start that process of ensuring that you have the best surrogate possible. The agency does so much of that legwork in the beginning with their background checks and their personal communications with you, the home visit, so they're literally looking at what did she tell me versus what do her records say, what her household says to me. So looking at my pregnancy records, they could see if there was any indication of nicotine, alcohol, any drug use. So when they don't see any of that, that puts them one step closer to trusting me as a surrogate. And like you were saying, it's very much a trust. You look at my old records and can see that I was completely responsible and healthy during my pregnancies. And you have to trust me to do that moving forward. Like you said, we are screened multiple times for drugs, alcohol, before pregnancy and during the entire pregnancy. That is something that you are able to get records through my doctor. So if you that was something you were concerned about, or and again in the contract as well, it is very explicitly laid out, and at any point if there was concern, you can request testing be done, things like that. But it's very much a trust thing for sure. You have to meet, you do this call, and you read the profile and you connect as best as you can, and then you just have to trust for sure.
And how was your personal experience as a surrogate? How were your intended parents? How was the relationship there?
Uh, I have developed very deep relationship with my intended families. My first surrogate baby is already 3 years old. We've had a very close relationship ever since. During my journeys, I've been lucky enough to meet with the families ahead of time, which is not always possible, especially now with the travel restrictions and Corona. That's a bit harder for people at the moment, but I was lucky enough to transfer at one of my intended parents' clinics where they were close, so we were able to meet. The other family, I took a trip to spend a week with them with my children and my husband. Um, I think in person, it definitely helps develop that personal connection. And I know after my first journey, the first week I got to spend in person during my pregnancy with the parents, at the end of it, one of them told me, seeing you in person made me so much more comfortable. I know you're drinking water. I know you're healthy. He expressed the difference that it made to see me and see how I was doing. We've kept that connection with both of my intended families. We exchange pictures and texts and calls to keep updated. We love to share about everybody's kids and what we've got going on. And I've been very lucky to have amazing families that I consider family. I'm Aunt Alexa to all the babies.
That's amazing. Yeah.
Can you give us some information about the cost? Because this is a question from a visitor who wants to have some indication what a surrogate mother costs.
So as a coordinator, we have each state has their average start for a first time surrogate. Idaho, for example, right now, the compensation just for the surrogate is 32,000, and
Okay.
it varies from state to state. And then typically, once you get a proven surrogate, the costs do get raised a bit more, just for the fact that you know that she has been able to have a successful transfer and pregnancy again. Um, Idaho is typically one of the lower costs when it comes to surrogates. They start to vary from there, but that's usually about the minimum probably right now.
And I will
Okay.
also say on the question of costs that so that you understand, because a process in the United States is not a cheap and never is anywhere, but it doesn't all happen in one boom. You know, you don't go and pay make a transfer of $42,000 to your surrogate. It's all very gradual. There are milestones in the process for payments, and they are dependent on progress and on, you know, meeting the terms of the agreement. So if a surrogate um, if surrogate becomes pregnant, then okay, she gets her base compensation, which Alexa mentioned, in intervals. So if she does not deliver term and delivers perhaps 2 months preterm, again, this is extremely rare, but then she will not receive the last portion that is relative to that to the pregnancy, because she didn't make it all the way to the end, and that is also part of how this whole system works, and it's mainly designed to protect the intended parents financially as well. So
Okay.
everything is kind
Yeah.
of, yeah.
Yeah, and I think it now comes the last question, because we are running out of time. For all the visitors, you can contact Yishai on the stand of New England Fertility Institute on the online show and make a personal appointment for tomorrow, I think.
Yeah, we'll be here tomorrow. Yes, sure. Happy to continue the conversation with anyone.
Okay, but I think the last question we will answer: are there legal problems to bring a child from surrogacy in the USA to Germany?
Oh no, not at all, because and it's not a problem to go anywhere in the world with a child from surrogacy in the U.S., because there are one of the most important things that you do in a process is, in the beginning, you speak to an attorney in your home country to understand exactly what the requirements are, and what you're going to need for your baby to ensure that you can travel back home and complete the parentage process at home and be the parent of this baby legally. So all of this will be well known in advance, and we will be able to navigate the process accordingly. But the short answer is that there's never a problem, because the baby will have a US passport as well,
Okay.
and you will go home with the baby on a US passport until you can complete the rest of the process in your home country in Germany, and obtain the German passport and all these other things. So there's never a problem with this. Never.
Okay. Then, like I said, the time is running out. I'd like to say thank you to Isha and Alexa. And like I said before, make a personal conversation with Isha tomorrow on the online show. I think you have some time slots left for personal consultations. You can go on the stand of New England Fertility and book your personal consultation. And I'd like to say thank you very much to all, and wish you a nice evening.
Thank you very much, Christopher.
Okay.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.